You know, there is something quite extraordinary that happens to a person when they begin to see beneath the surface of things, when the veil lifts and consciousness awakens to its own depths. It is not what most people imagine awakening to be. They picture enlightenment as a kind of permanent joy, a state of unshakable peace, where all questions are answered and all struggles cease. But this is a fantasy, a comfortable lie we tell ourselves about the nature of spiritual development. True awakening is far more dangerous than that. It is the moment when you realize that almost everything you have been taught about reality is incomplete, when you discover that the human psyche contains depths that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. When you understand that consciousness itself is not the simple, unified thing we pretend it to be, but a vast landscape of light and shadow, of known and unknown territories. And when this realization comes, when you begin to see what others cannot or will not see, you face a choice that will determine the course of your entire life. Do you share what you have discovered? Do you attempt to guide others toward the same recognition? Or do you remain silent, protecting both yourself and them from truths that can shatter a person's carefully constructed world? I have spent my life exploring the human soul, diving into the unconscious mind, mapping the territories of dreams and symbols and forgotten memories. And I have learned something that may surprise you. The greatest danger facing anyone who awakens to deeper realities is not the darkness they discover within themselves. It is the compulsion to reveal that darkness to others before they are ready to face it. There are certain things, you see, that the awakened person comes to know. Certain truths about human nature, about the shadow that lives within every soul, about the illusions that society depends upon to function. These are not merely intellectual concepts. They are living realities that burn themselves into consciousness once they are truly seen. And the temptation, the almost irresistible urge, is to share these discoveries with everyone around you. But this is where wisdom must temper enthusiasm. This is where the mature soul learns the difference between truth and timing, between insight and interference. Because there are 5 particular revelations that come to those who journey deeply into consciousness. 5 recognitions that can transform a person's understanding of themselves and their world. And each of these, if shared carelessly, can destroy relationships, shatter communities, and leave both the speaker and the listener worse off than before. The first of these dangerous truths concerns the nature of human motivation itself. When consciousness develops beyond a certain point, when you begin to see clearly into the depths of human behavior, you start to recognize something quite disturbing. You realize that most people, most of the time, do not act from the noble motivations they claim. They do not even act from the motivations they believe themselves to have. Instead, they are driven by forces they have never examined, by needs they refuse to acknowledge, by fears they have buried so deeply that they mistake them for virtues. The businessman who claims to work for his family's security is often fleeing from his own sense of inadequacy. The woman who dedicates herself to helping others may be desperately trying to prove her own worth. The religious person who speaks constantly of love may be driven primarily by a terror of judgment. This is not cynicism speaking. This is simply the recognition that human beings are far more complex than they appear, even to themselves. The conscious mind, you see, is like the tip of an iceberg. It is the small visible portion of a vast structure that extends far beneath the surface. And it is in those hidden depths that our real motivations live, our true desires and fears and longings. When you develop the capacity to see these hidden drivers, when you can look at a person and understand not just what they are saying, but why they need to say it, you possess a kind of power. But it is a power that must be wielded with extraordinary care. Because the moment you reveal to someone the unconscious forces that drive them, you threaten the very foundation of their identity. I have watched this happen countless times. A person awakens to psychological insight and immediately begins pointing out everyone else's hidden motivations. They tell their friend that her constant busyness is really an escape from loneliness. They inform their colleague that his aggressive ambition stems from childhood wounds. They explain to their family members the unconscious patterns that govern their behavior. And what happens? The relationships crumble. Not because the insights are wrong, but because they are right. And most people are not prepared to have their unconscious motivations exposed, especially by someone they trusted to see them as they present themselves to the world. The awakened person must learn to carry this knowledge silently, to see deeply without the compulsion to share everything they see, to understand that true compassion sometimes means allowing others to maintain their necessary illusions until they are strong enough to face the truth beneath them. This brings us to the second dangerous revelation that comes with spiritual awakening. The recognition that suffering, real suffering, is not an accident or a mistake or something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. It is an essential part of human development. It is the force that drives consciousness to grow, that pushes the soul to expand beyond its comfortable boundaries. But this understanding flies in the face of everything our culture teaches us about pain. We are told that happiness is the goal, that comfort is the ideal, that any form of suffering represents a problem to be solved. We medicate our anxiety, distract ourselves from our sadness, and run from any experience that might force us to confront the deeper questions of existence. The awakened person sees through this illusion. They understand that suffering, when faced consciously, becomes the raw material for wisdom. They recognize that their own greatest growth has come not from their moments of joy and success, but from their encounters with loss, failure, disappointment, and grief. But imagine trying to explain this to someone in the midst of their pain. Imagine telling a person who is struggling with depression that their suffering might be exactly what their soul needs for its development, or suggesting to someone grieving a loss that this experience, however terrible, may be preparing them for a deeper understanding of life. Even if these things are true, and I believe they often are, sharing such insights at the wrong moment or with the wrong person can cause tremendous harm. It can make suffering people feel judged, misunderstood, or abandoned in their time of need. It can transform natural grief into guilt or depression into despair. The wise person learns to hold this understanding privately. They may use it to make sense of their own difficulties, to find meaning in their own struggles. But they do not impose this perspective on others unless those others are genuinely ready to receive it. They learn that timing is everything, that the same truth can heal or harm depending on when and how it is shared. The third revelation concerns the nature of love itself. As consciousness develops, as you begin to see more clearly into human relationships, you start to recognize something that most people would rather not acknowledge. Much of what we call love is not love at all. It is need, dependency, projection, or simple habit masquerading as affection. True love, the kind that nourishes the soul and supports genuine growth, is actually quite rare. It requires a level of self-knowledge and emotional maturity that most people have not developed. It demands the ability to see another person as they truly are, rather than as we need them to be. It asks us to support their growth even when that growth takes them away from us. Most relationships, if we are honest about them, are based on unconscious contracts. I will play this role if you play that one. I will meet these needs if you meet those. I will maintain this image if you maintain that. And as long as both parties honor the contract, the relationship feels like love. But the moment someone begins to grow, to change, to discover parts of themselves that don't fit the established pattern, the contract is threatened. And what we thought was love reveals itself to be something else entirely. Possessiveness, control, fear of abandonment, or simple comfort with the familiar. The awakened person sees this dynamic everywhere. In marriages, where partners resist each other's development. In friendships, where growth is subtly discouraged. In families, where certain roles must never be questioned. They understand that genuine love is not threatened by change, but actually encourages it, even when that change is uncomfortable or inconvenient. But try explaining this to someone whose marriage is built on unconscious contracts. Try telling a parent that their love for their child might actually be limiting the child's development. Try suggesting to someone that their closest friendship might be based more on mutual dependency than genuine affection. Such revelations, however true, can devastate people who are not prepared to examine the foundations of their most important relationships. They can destroy families, end marriages, and leave people feeling utterly alone in the world, not because the relationships were false, but because they were not yet ready to become genuine. The fourth dangerous truth that awakens with consciousness is perhaps the most unsettling of all. It concerns the shadow, that dark aspect of human nature that exists within every soul. As you develop psychologically, as you begin to explore the depths of your own being, you inevitably encounter parts of yourself that you would rather not acknowledge. You discover that you are capable of cruelty, of selfishness, of thoughts and feelings that horrify the image you have of yourself. You realize that the potential for great evil lives alongside the potential for great good in every human heart. And more disturbing still, you begin to see this shadow not just in obviously wicked people, but in everyone around you, including those you love most. This is not a comfortable recognition. It shatters the naive belief that people are simply good or bad, light or dark. It reveals that human nature is far more complex and contradictory than most of us want to admit. It shows us that the capacity for both creation and destruction lives within every soul, and that which one manifests depends on circumstances we cannot always control. But sharing this understanding carelessly can be devastating. When you point out someone's shadow before they are ready to see it, you can trigger shame, denial, or a complete breakdown of their self-concept. When you reveal the darkness that lives within apparently good people, you can destroy their faith in humanity itself. The shadow must be encountered gradually, gently, with tremendous care and support. It is work that each person must do for themselves, in their own time, with their own courage. No one can force another to face their darkness, and attempting to do so often drives that darkness deeper underground, where it becomes even more dangerous. And finally, there is the fifth revelation, perhaps the most profound and the most dangerous to share. It concerns the nature of spiritual awakening itself. As you journey deeper into consciousness, as you begin to understand the vast complexity of human psychology, you realize something that contradicts everything popular spirituality teaches. You discover that awakening is not a destination but a process, not an achievement but a continual unfolding, not a state of perfection but an ongoing encounter with the mystery of existence. And most challenging of all, you realize that true spiritual development often looks nothing like what people expect it to look like. The genuinely awakened person may appear quite ordinary. They may struggle with the same human challenges as everyone else. They may doubt, question, and sometimes fail to live up to their own understanding. Because awakening does not eliminate the human condition, it simply brings consciousness to it. But our culture craves spiritual heroes, enlightened masters who have transcended all difficulty and achieved permanent bliss. When the awakened person tries to share the reality of their experience, the ongoing nature of the work, the fact that consciousness brings not escape from humanity but deeper engagement with it, people often feel disappointed or betrayed. They want certainty, not mystery. They want answers, not better questions. They want to believe that somewhere, someone has figured it all out and can save them from the difficulty of their own development. Sharing the true nature of awakening can rob people of hope, can make the spiritual journey seem too difficult or too uncertain to pursue. It can discourage those who are just beginning to explore consciousness, who need to believe in the possibility of transformation even if they don't yet understand its true nature. These 5 revelations, these dangerous truths that come with spiritual awakening, must be carried with tremendous wisdom, not because they are false, but because they are true. And truth, like fire, can warm and illuminate when handled skillfully, or burn and destroy when wielded carelessly. The awakened person learns to live with these understandings privately, to let them guide their own choices without imposing them on others. They discover that the greatest gift they can offer is not their insights but their presence, not their knowledge but their being. Dangerous truths that come with spiritual awakening, must they don't yet understand its true nature. These 5 revelations, these be carried with tremendous wisdom. Truth, like fire, can warm, but because they are true, and not because they are false, and illuminate when handled skillfully, or to live with these understandings privately without imposing them on others. They discover that the greatest gift to let them guide their own choices can offer is not their insights, but their presence. Not their knowledge, but their being burn and destroy when wielded carelessly. The awakened person learns. You see, there comes a moment in the development of consciousness when you realize something quite unsettling about the nature of truth itself, not the comfortable truths we share in drawing rooms or write in letters to friends, but the living truths that move through the depths of human experience like underground rivers, shaping everything from beneath while remaining largely invisible to the surface mind. I have spent decades observing the human psyche, watching how it unfolds and contracts, how it reveals and conceals itself. And I have come to understand that consciousness, when it truly awakens, carries within it a terrible burden. It is the burden of seeing what others cannot yet see, of knowing what others are not yet ready to know, and perhaps most challenging of all, it is the burden of recognizing when such knowledge must be held in silence. You must understand, the awakened soul does not simply acquire new information about reality. It undergoes a fundamental transformation in its capacity to perceive. It begins to see patterns where others see only isolated events. It recognizes the deeper currents that move beneath the surface of human behavior. It perceives the invisible threads that connect all things, the hidden laws that govern the unfolding of individual destiny and collective fate. But with this expanded perception comes a profound responsibility, because the truths that consciousness reveals to itself are not neutral facts to be shared freely. They are living forces that can heal or harm, liberate or destroy, depending upon the soil into which they fall. And the awakened person must learn to distinguish between fertile ground and barren rock, between souls that are ready to receive difficult truths and those that would be crushed by their weight. Consider, for instance, what happens when you begin to perceive the unconscious motivations that drive human behavior. You start to see that the minister who speaks so passionately about divine love may be fleeing from his own capacity for hatred, that the woman who dedicates herself to social causes may be attempting to atone for some unnamed guilt that haunts her sleep, that the man who accumulates wealth and power may be trying to fill a void that no external achievement can ever satisfy. These recognitions come not through judgment, but through understanding. You see these patterns not to condemn, but to comprehend the magnificent complexity of the human soul. But imagine the devastation that would follow if you were to share such perceptions carelessly. Imagine walking up to that minister and explaining the shadow forces that drive his religious devotion, or telling that dedicated woman that her good works spring from unconscious guilt rather than pure compassion. Even if these insights were accurate, even if they contained profound truth, sharing them at the wrong moment or in the wrong way would accomplish nothing but destruction. The minister would likely respond with outrage or despair. The woman would feel attacked and misunderstood, and you, the bearer of unwelcome truth, would find yourself isolated and rejected by those you sought to help. This is why wisdom must always accompany insight. This is why the development of consciousness must be paired with the cultivation of discretion. The awakened person learns to carry their perceptions like a physician carries his instruments, using them only when the patient is ready for treatment and only in ways that promote healing rather than harm. But there is another dimension to this challenge that runs even deeper. As consciousness expands, you begin to recognize something quite disturbing about the nature of human relationships themselves. You start to see that much of what we call love is actually something else entirely. Need masquerading as affection, fear disguised as devotion, control presenting itself as care. True love, the kind that nourishes the soul and supports genuine development, requires something most people have not yet achieved. It demands the capacity to see another person clearly, without the distorting lens of your own needs and projections. It asks you to support their growth even when that growth leads them away from you. It calls you to love not the image you have created of them, but the living reality of who they are becoming. Most relationships, if we examine them honestly, are built upon unconscious agreements, unspoken contracts that govern how each person will behave, what roles they will play, what aspects of themselves they will reveal or conceal. And as long as both parties honor these invisible agreements, the relationship feels stable and satisfying. But the moment someone begins to awaken, the moment they start to discover parts of themselves that don't fit the established pattern, these unconscious contracts are threatened. The wife, who has always been submissive, begins to assert her own opinions. The husband, who has been the steady provider, starts to explore his creative nature. The child who has been the perfect student suddenly questions everything they have been taught. When this happens, what we thought was love often reveals itself to be something quite different. The threatened partner may respond with anger, manipulation, or emotional withdrawal. They may accuse the changing person of becoming selfish or losing their way. They may use guilt, fear, or obligation to try to pull them back into the familiar pattern. This is not conscious cruelty. Most people who respond this way are genuinely convinced they are acting out of love. They cannot see that their resistance to their partner's growth springs not from care, but from their own fear of abandonment. their own need for security, their own terror of change. The awakened person sees all of this with painful clarity. They understand that genuine love would celebrate growth, even difficult growth. They recognize that real affection would support transformation, even when that transformation is uncomfortable or inconvenient. But sharing this understanding with someone whose relationships are built on unconscious contracts can be devastating. Imagine trying to explain to a woman that her husband's jealousy is not a sign of his love, but of his own insecurity. Or telling a man that his mother's constant worry about him is not maternal care, but a form of emotional control. Even if these perceptions are accurate, sharing them before the person is ready to examine their relationships honestly will likely result in anger, denial, and the destruction of trust. This brings us to perhaps the most challenging aspect of awakened consciousness: the recognition that suffering, real suffering, is not an accident to be avoided, but an essential element of human development. That pain, when faced consciously, becomes the raw material from which wisdom is forged. Our entire culture is built upon the assumption that happiness is the goal and suffering is the enemy. We are taught to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, to seek comfort and flee difficulty. We medicate our anxiety, distract ourselves from sadness, and run from any experience that might force us to confront the deeper questions of existence. But consciousness reveals a different truth. It shows us that our greatest growth has come not from our moments of joy and success, but from our encounters with loss, failure, and disappointment. It demonstrates that the experiences we would choose to avoid are often exactly what our souls need for their development. The death that forces us to confront the reality of impermanence. The betrayal that teaches us about the complexities of human nature. The failure that humbles our pride and opens us to new possibilities. The illness that slows us down enough to examine what we have been running toward or running from. None of us would choose these experiences if we could avoid them. But looking back, many of us can see that they were the very experiences that cracked us open, that forced us to grow beyond our comfortable limitations, that revealed capacities we never knew we possessed. The awakened consciousness holds this paradox without trying to resolve it. It understands that life's difficulties are not punishments to be endured, but initiations to be undergone. It recognizes that the soul often grows through challenges that the ego would prefer to avoid. But imagine trying to share this perspective with someone in the midst of acute suffering. Imagine telling a person grieving the loss of a child that this experience might be exactly what their soul needs for its development. Or suggesting to someone struggling with serious illness that their condition could be a gateway to deeper understanding. Even if these things contain profound truths, sharing such insights at the wrong moment can transform natural grief into guilt, depression into despair. It can make suffering people feel judged, misunderstood, or abandoned in their greatest time of need. The wise person learns to hold this understanding privately, to use it for making sense of their own difficulties without imposing it on others. They may offer presence, support, and compassion to those who suffer, but they do not attempt to explain away pain or justify hardship unless they are certain the sufferer is ready to receive such perspectives. And finally, there is the most profound and perhaps most dangerous revelation that comes with spiritual awakening, the recognition that consciousness itself is not what most people imagine it to be. That awakening is not a destination but a journey, not an achievement but a process, not a state of perfection but an ongoing encounter with mystery. Popular spirituality would have us believe that enlightenment is a permanent condition of bliss and wisdom, that awakened beings have transcended all human difficulties and achieved unshakable peace. We create images of spiritual masters who never doubt, never struggle, never face the ordinary challenges that plague the rest of us. But genuine awakening reveals something quite different. It shows us that consciousness is like a vast ocean with countless depths yet to be explored, that each level of understanding opens onto new mysteries, new questions, new territories of the unknown, that the more deeply we see into the nature of reality, the more we realize how much we do not and cannot know. The truly awakened person may appear quite ordinary. They may struggle with the same human challenges as everyone else, may doubt and question and sometimes fail to live up to their own understanding, because awakening does not eliminate the human condition but brings consciousness to it. It does not provide escape from difficulty but offers the possibility of meeting difficulty with greater awareness and acceptance. This is perhaps the most disillusioning discovery for those who seek spiritual development as a form of transcendence. They want to believe that somewhere someone has figured it all out, has achieved permanent freedom from uncertainty and struggle. They want a spiritual hero who can save them from the necessity of their own development. When the awakened person attempts to share the reality of their experience, the ongoing nature of the work, the fact that consciousness brings not escape but deeper engagement, people often feel betrayed. They wanted certainty, not mystery. They sought answers, not better questions. They hoped for a guru who would eliminate their need to face the unknown within themselves. Sharing the true nature of awakening can rob people of the hope they need to begin their own journey. It can make the spiritual path seem too uncertain, too demanding, too devoid of the guarantees they crave. And so the awakened person learns to remain silent about the ongoing nature of their development, to allow others their necessary illusions until they develop the strength to face reality without such consolations. These are the dangerous truths that consciousness reveals, the revelations that must be carried in silence until the time is right for their sharing, not because they are false, but because they are true. And truth, like medicine, can heal or poison depending upon the timing and manner of its administration. The awakened soul learns to live with these understandings as a secret wisdom, letting them guide personal choices without forcing them upon others. They discover that the greatest gift they can offer the world is not their insights, but their transformed presence, not their knowledge, but their being. Deep presence, not their knowledge, but their being. For you see, when consciousness begins to stir from its long slumber, when the soul starts to recognize itself in the mirror of existence, something quite remarkable occurs. You find yourself standing at the threshold between two worlds. Behind you lies the familiar territory of unconscious living, that comfortable realm where questions remain unasked and shadows stay hidden in their appointed corners. Before you stretches the vast landscape of awakened awareness, beautiful and terrible in its infinite complexity. And it is here, at this threshold, that you must learn perhaps the most difficult lesson of all. The recognition that your awakening, however profound it may feel to you, however transformative it has been for your own existence, is not a gift you can simply hand to another person like a book or a flower. I have watched this pattern repeat itself countless times in my work with the human psyche. A person undergoes some fundamental shift in consciousness. Perhaps they have encountered their shadow for the first time and recognized the stranger living within their own heart. Perhaps They have experienced what we might call a numinous moment, an encounter with the sacred that has shattered their previous understanding of reality. Or perhaps they have simply begun to see through the elaborate theater of social convention and recognized the profound loneliness that exists beneath our collective performances. Whatever the catalyst, they find themselves suddenly awake in a way they have never been before. The world looks different. People appear transparent. The hidden connections between things become visible. And naturally, powerfully, they feel compelled to share this new vision with everyone around them. This is where the real tragedy begins. Because the newly awakened soul, intoxicated by their own transformation, believes that consciousness can be transmitted through words, that insight can be given like charity to those who seem to need it most. They begin to speak of what they have seen, to point out the unconscious patterns they observe in others, to offer their revelations as gifts to friends and family who have not asked for such offerings. And what happens? The very people they most want to help begin to retreat from them. Conversations become strained. Relationships grow distant. The awakened person finds themselves increasingly isolated, not because their perceptions are wrong, but because they have forgotten something fundamental about the nature of human development. They have forgotten that consciousness cannot be forced upon another soul any more than you can force a seed to grow by pulling on its stem. Each person must come to their own awakening in their own time, through their own struggles, by their own mysterious inner process. And until that natural unfolding occurs, all the wisdom in the world will fall upon deaf ears. But there is something even more subtle at work here, something that the eager, newly awakened often fail to recognize. In their enthusiasm to share what they have discovered, they may actually be serving their own psychological needs rather than genuinely helping others. The compulsion to enlighten, to wake people up, to point out their unconscious patterns, often springs not from compassion but from a kind of spiritual pride. You see, when you have made the difficult journey from unconsciousness to awareness, when you have faced your own shadow and survived the encounter, when you have begun to see through the illusions that once held you captive, there is a natural temptation to feel superior to those who still dwell in darkness. Not consciously, perhaps, not with malicious intent, but somewhere in the depths of the psyche, a voice whispers that you have achieved something others have not, that you possess something they lack. And from this place, this subtle sense of spiritual superiority, the urge to awaken others, becomes contaminated. What appears to be loving service may actually be a form of unconscious aggression. The awakened person may be using their insights as weapons, their perceptions as tools of judgment, their knowledge as a way of maintaining distance from the very humanity they claim to want to help. I have seen this pattern destroy marriages, shatter friendships, and alienate children from their parents. The awakened person, convinced of their good intentions, cannot understand why others react with hostility to their offerings of truth. They blame the recipients for being closed-minded, defensive, or simply not ready for growth. But they rarely examine their own motivations, rarely ask whether their compulsion to enlighten others might serve purposes they would prefer not to acknowledge. This is why the mature soul learns to carry its insights in silence, not out of secrecy or selfishness, but out of genuine respect for the autonomy of other human beings. They understand that each person must find their own path to consciousness, must encounter their own obstacles, must develop their own relationship with the deeper mysteries of existence. But there is yet another dimension to this challenge that runs even deeper than questions of timing and motivation. As consciousness develops, as you begin to see more clearly into the hidden dynamics of human behavior, you inevitably encounter something that most people would prefer to keep buried. You begin to recognize the shadow not just in yourself but in everyone around you, including those you love most dearly. You see the cruelty that hides behind kindness, the selfishness that masquerades as generosity, the fear that presents itself as righteousness. You recognize that every human being, without exception, carries within themselves the capacity for both great good and terrible evil. And more disturbing still, you begin to understand that which aspect manifests often depends upon circumstances beyond conscious control. This recognition can be profoundly unsettling. It shatters the comfortable belief that people are simply good or bad, light or dark. It reveals human nature to be far more complex and contradictory than most of us want to acknowledge. It shows us that the seeds of every crime, every betrayal, every act of violence that has ever been committed exist somewhere within our own psychological makeup. Now imagine trying to share this understanding with someone who has not yet encountered their own shadow. Imagine explaining to a person who prides themselves on their moral purity that they too carry darkness within them. Imagine telling someone who sees themselves as fundamentally good that they possess the same destructive potentials as those they judge and condemn. Such revelations, however true they might be, can trigger profound psychological crises in those who are not prepared to receive them. They can shatter a person's self-concept, destroy their faith in human nature, or drive them deeper into denial and projection. The shadow must be encountered gradually, gently, with tremendous support and care. It is work that each soul must undertake for itself when it is ready with its own courage. No one can force another to face their darkness, and attempting to do so, however well-intentioned, often drives that darkness deeper underground, where it becomes even more dangerous. The wise person learns to see the shadow in others without feeling compelled to expose it, to understand human complexity without needing to explain it to those who are not yet ready for such understanding. And then there is perhaps the most challenging recognition of all. As you journey deeper into the territories of consciousness, as you begin to understand the vast mystery of human existence, you realize something that contradicts almost everything our culture teaches about spiritual development. You discover that awakening does not eliminate suffering, but transforms your relationship to it. That consciousness does not provide escape from the human condition, but offers the possibility of meeting that condition with greater awareness and acceptance. That the truly awakened person may struggle with the same difficulties as everyone else, but approaches those difficulties from a fundamentally different perspective. This understanding flies in the face of popular spiritual teachings that promise transcendence, permanent bliss, or freedom from all forms of pain and uncertainty. People want to believe that somewhere, someone has figured it all out, has achieved a state of unshakable peace and wisdom. They seek spiritual teachers who can guarantee them escape from the difficulties of being human. But genuine awakening reveals something quite different. It shows us that consciousness is not a destination but a journey, not an achievement but a process, not a solution but a deeper engagement with mystery. The awakened person may doubt, question, and sometimes fail to live up to their own understanding. They may experience sadness, fear, and confusion just like everyone else. But they meet these experiences with a quality of presence that transforms their meaning. Sharing this reality with someone who seeks spiritual development as a form of escape can be deeply disillusioning. It can rob them of the hope they need to begin their own journey. It can make the path seem too uncertain, too demanding, too devoid of the guarantees they crave. And so the truly awakened learn to remain silent about the ongoing nature of their work, allowing others their necessary illusions until they develop the strength to face reality without such consolations. You begin to understand that your role is not to wake others up, but to remain awake yourself. Not to force consciousness upon those around you, but to embody consciousness so fully that it becomes a living invitation. Not to explain the mysteries you have encountered, but to live those mysteries with such authenticity that others may glimpse the possibility of their own transformation. This is perhaps the most profound teaching that comes with genuine spiritual development. The recognition that the greatest gift you can offer the world is not your insights, not your knowledge, not your understanding of psychological dynamics or spiritual truths. The greatest gift you can offer is your transformed presence, your authentic being, your willingness to remain conscious in a world that often prefers to sleep. When you embody this understanding, when you learn to carry your awareness without the compulsion to share it carelessly, something beautiful begins to happen. People are drawn to your presence without understanding why. They feel safer in your company, more able to be themselves, more willing to explore their own depths. Not because you are teaching them or guiding them or pointing out their unconscious patterns, but because you have created a space in which consciousness can emerge naturally, organically, in its own time. This is the art of conscious living. To see deeply without the need to expose what you see. To understand profoundly without the compulsion to explain your understanding. To carry wisdom without wielding it as a weapon or wearing it as a badge of spiritual achievement. And in this silence, in this patient holding of awareness without the urgency to transmit it, consciousness does its deepest work. Not through words or explanations or revelations forced upon unwilling recipients, but through the simple, powerful presence of a human being who has learned to be genuinely awake while remaining genuinely human. The awakened soul becomes like a deep well in the desert, not announcing itself, not calling attention to its depths, but simply existing as a source of refreshment for those who are truly thirsty, who approach not because they have been convinced of their need, but because their own inner drought has made them desperate enough to seek what lies beneath the surface of ordinary existence. This is why the wise remain silent about what they have seen, not because they do not care, but because they care too much to interfere with the sacred process by which each soul finds its own way home to itself. And so we come to perhaps the most perilous territory of all, the realm where awakened consciousness must confront its own relationship to truth itself. You see, there is a particular kind of suffering that belongs exclusively to those who have learned to see beneath the surface of things. It is the suffering of carrying knowledge that others cannot yet bear to receive. I have walked through this territory myself many times, and I can tell you that it changes you in ways you do not expect. When you first begin to perceive the hidden currents that move through human relationships, when you start to recognize the unconscious forces that shape individual destiny, there is a kind of intoxication that comes with such seeing. You feel as though you have been given a master key that unlocks every mystery, explains every conflict, illuminates every shadow, but this intoxication is dangerous. It seduces you into believing that your role is to unlock these mysteries for others, to explain their conflicts to them, to illuminate their shadows, whether they wish to see them or not. And it is here that consciousness can become its own trap, where awakening can transform into a form of unconscious cruelty. I remember a patient who came to me many years ago, a woman who had recently undergone what she described as a spiritual awakening. She had begun to see, she told me, the psychological patterns that governed her family's behavior. Her husband's need for control, her children's unconscious rebellion, her own mother's manipulative tendencies, all of this had become crystal clear to her, and she felt it was her duty to share these insights with those she loved. But what she discovered, to her bewilderment and pain, was that her family did not welcome her revelations. Her husband became defensive when she pointed out his controlling behavior. Her children grew distant when she explained the psychological roots of their rebellion. Her mother accused her of being judgmental and unkind. This woman could not understand why her gifts of insight were being rejected. She was offering truth, she believed. She was providing understanding that could free her loved ones from their unconscious patterns. Why were they responding with anger and withdrawal? What, she had not yet learned, was something that takes great maturity to accept. Truth, however accurate it may be, becomes destructive when it is offered without invitation, without proper timing, without the delicate sensitivity that recognizes when a soul is ready to receive difficult knowledge about itself. The woman's insights about her family may have been entirely correct, but her compulsion to share them revealed something she had not yet seen about herself. Her need to enlighten others was serving her own psychological requirements rather than genuinely helping those around her. She was using her awakened consciousness as a way of maintaining distance from her own unresolved conflicts, her own need for control, her own shadow material that she had not yet fully integrated. This is what I call the spiritual shadow. It is the darkness that can emerge from the light itself when consciousness becomes contaminated with ego, when awakening serves not the soul's genuine development, but the personality's need for superiority, control, or significance. The truly awakened person learns to recognize this shadow within their own spiritual development. They understand that the urge to wake others up, to point out their unconscious patterns, to offer unsolicited psychological insights, often springs not from love, but from a subtle form of aggression. It is the aggression of the person who has climbed a mountain looking down upon those still in the valley below. But there is something even more profound that consciousness reveals about the nature of human transformation. As you journey deeper into your own psyche, as you encounter the vast territories of the unconscious mind, you begin to understand something that most people find deeply disturbing. You realize that the individual human being is not the separate autonomous entity we imagine ourselves to be. We are instead part of a vast web of interconnected consciousness. The thoughts we think, the feelings we feel, the patterns we live out, these are not entirely our own. They belong to what I have come to call the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of the psyche that we share with all humanity. When you truly see this, when you understand that your individual consciousness is like a wave on an infinite ocean, it changes everything. You realize that the person standing before you is not just themselves, but a living expression of archetypal forces that have been moving through human beings for thousands of years. The angry man is not just angry. He is possessed by the archetype of the warrior, the destroyer, the shadow king. The nurturing woman is not just caring. She is embodying the great mother, the eternal feminine, the life-giving principle itself. This recognition brings both profound compassion and terrible responsibility. Compassion because you understand that people are not entirely responsible for the forces that move through them. They are, in many ways, unconscious vehicles for energies far greater than their individual will can control. But responsibility because you also understand that consciousness, when it truly awakens, has the capacity to relate to these archetypal forces more consciously, to become a partner in their expression rather than merely their victim. Yet sharing this understanding with someone who still believes themselves to be a separate, autonomous individual can be devastating. It can destroy their sense of personal agency, their belief in free will, their confidence in their own moral choices. It can make them feel like puppets dancing to invisible strings, meaningless participants in some cosmic drama they neither understand nor control. The wise person learns to hold this knowledge privately, to use it for understanding the deeper patterns that move through human experience without stripping others of their necessary illusion of individual autonomy. They recognize that each person must come to this understanding, if they come to it at all, through their own encounter with the depths of their own being. And then there is perhaps the most difficult revelation of all, the recognition that consciousness itself may not be what we imagine it to be, that the very faculty we use to perceive reality, to make sense of our experience, to understand ourselves and others, is far more mysterious and far less reliable than we want to believe. In my exploration of the human psyche, in my encounters with patients whose minds had ventured into territories most people never experience, I have been forced to confront something quite unsettling. The possibility that what we call consciousness, what we take to be our most reliable guide to truth, may itself be subject to forces beyond our comprehension or control. I have witnessed people whose consciousness seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of their individual minds, who appeared to access information they could not possibly have known through ordinary means. I have seen others whose psychic material seemed to come from sources that transcended their personal experience, that connected them to depths of knowledge and wisdom they had never consciously acquired. These encounters have led me to question some of our most basic assumptions about the nature of mind, about the relationship between individual consciousness and the larger reality in which it exists. They have suggested to me that consciousness may be less like a spotlight we direct upon reality and more like a radio receiver tuning into frequencies that are already present in the atmosphere of existence itself. But imagine trying to share such possibilities with someone whose entire sense of reality depends upon the belief that their consciousness is their own private possession, that their thoughts belong entirely to them, that their perceptions can be trusted to provide accurate information about an objective external world. Such revelations can trigger what we might call an ontological crisis, a fundamental questioning of the nature of existence itself. They can leave a person feeling unmoored from everything they thought they knew about themselves and their place in the universe. They can destroy the very foundations upon which a person has built their sense of identity and meaning. This is why those who have journeyed deeply into consciousness learn to speak carefully about what they have discovered there, not because they doubt the reality of their experience, but because they understand that such realities must be encountered gradually, with proper preparation, with adequate support for the psychological upheaval they inevitably produce. The awakened soul becomes like a deep-sea diver who has returned from depths where most people could not survive. They carry within them memories of pressure and darkness that would crush an unprepared consciousness. They have seen forms of life that exist in territories where ordinary awareness cannot function. But they do not attempt to drag others down to those depths before they have developed the capacity to withstand what they will find there. Instead, they remain available. They live their lives in such a way that others may sense the possibility of greater depths, may glimpse the existence of territories beyond their current understanding. But they do not force such recognitions upon anyone. They understand that consciousness must develop organically, that each person must find their own way to the deeper waters of existence. And in this patient availability, In this willingness to embody what they have learned without the compulsion to teach it directly, they serve something far greater than their own need to be understood. They serve the slow, mysterious process by which consciousness evolves, by which humanity gradually awakens to its own deeper nature. For you see, consciousness is not something that belongs to us individually. It is something we participate in, something that moves through us, something that we serve rather than possess. And those who have awakened to this understanding know that their highest responsibility is not to their own enlightenment, not to their own spiritual achievement, but to the larger evolution of awareness itself. They become servants of consciousness rather than its masters. They learn to hold their insights lightly, to carry their wisdom without attachment, to remain open to the possibility that everything they think they know may be transformed by the next moment's revelation. This is the ultimate secret that the awakened must keep. Not any particular piece of knowledge or insight, but the recognition that consciousness itself is far more vast, far more mysterious, far more sacred than most people are prepared to imagine. It is a secret kept not through concealment, but through reverence, not through withholding, but through a deep respect for the timing and readiness of each individual soul. And perhaps this is the most profound truth of all, that the greatest service we can offer to consciousness, to our fellow human beings, to existence itself, is not to force our understanding upon others, but to live so authentically, so consciously, so fully awake that we become living invitations to the deeper possibilities that exist within every human heart. In the end, the awakened person discovers that their role is not to be a teacher, but to be a question, not to provide answers, but to embody the mystery that calls others to seek their own answers, not to illuminate others, but to burn so brightly with their own authentic flame that others may find the courage to kindle their own inner fire. This is why silence becomes sacred, not the silence of secrecy or withdrawal, but the silence of deep respect for the mystery of each individual soul's journey toward its own awakening. The silence that creates space for consciousness to emerge naturally, organically, in its own perfect timing. For consciousness, like love, cannot be forced. It can only be invited, nurtured, and allowed to unfold according to its own inner wisdom. And those who have learned to serve this unfolding know that their greatest gift is not what they say, but who they have become through their own encounter with the depths of being human. They become something far more precious and far more dangerous. They become carriers of a particular kind of fire that can either illuminate or consume, depending upon how carefully it is tended. I have observed this phenomenon countless times in my work with the human soul. A person reaches a certain depth in their psychological development, encounters certain truths about the nature of existence, and suddenly finds themselves in possession of knowledge that feels both liberating and terrifying. They have looked into the abyss, as Nietzsche might say, and discovered that it was looking back at them all along. But here is what I have learned through decades of exploring these depths. The person who has truly awakened to the mysteries of consciousness faces a choice that will define not only their own spiritual development, but their capacity to serve the greater unfolding of human awareness. They can become either a wise guardian of the mysteries or an unconscious destroyer of the very thing they seek to share. You see, there is a particular quality that emerges in consciousness when it has been refined through genuine suffering, through real encounter with the shadow, through honest confrontation with the illusions that once provided comfort and meaning. This quality is what I might call discriminating compassion. It is the capacity to see deeply into another person's psychological condition and to respond not with what you think they need, but with what their soul is actually ready to receive. I remember sitting with a colleague many years ago, a man who had undergone what he considered to be a profound spiritual transformation. He had encountered his own unconscious material, had worked through significant psychological complexes, had achieved what seemed to be genuine insight into the workings of his own mind. But there was something in his manner that troubled me, something in the way he spoke about his wife, his children, his patients. He had begun to see their psychological patterns with great clarity. This was true. But he wielded this clarity like a surgeon's knife, cutting into their unconscious defenses without regard for whether they possessed the strength to survive such exposure. He justified this approach as honesty, as service to truth, as love that refused to enable continued unconsciousness. But what I witnessed was something quite different. I saw a man who was using his psychological insights as a weapon against the very people he claimed to care about most. His awakening had become contaminated with a subtle but powerful need to prove his own superiority, to demonstrate that he had achieved something others lacked. This is perhaps the most dangerous trap that awaits the awakening soul. The temptation to use consciousness itself as a form of unconscious aggression, to employ spiritual insight in service of the ego rather than in service of genuine love, to become what we might call a psychological predator, someone who feeds on others' unconsciousness rather than supporting their gradual movement toward greater awareness. The truly mature person learns to recognize this tendency within themselves. They understand that the urge to expose, to analyze, to interpret another person's psychological material often springs not from compassion, but from their own unresolved need for power, significance, or control. They learn to hold their insights lightly, to offer them only when they are genuinely requested, and to withdraw them immediately if they sense resistance or harm. But there is something even more subtle at work here, something that touches upon the very nature of consciousness itself. As you develop psychologically, as you begin to perceive the deeper patterns that govern human behavior, you inevitably confront a troubling recognition. You realize that most people, most of the time, are not actually living their own lives. They are living out unconscious scripts, playing roles that were written for them by forces they have never examined. The dutiful son who sacrifices his own dreams to fulfill his father's expectations. The rebellious daughter who defines herself entirely in opposition to her mother's values. The successful businessman who accumulates wealth and status to compensate for some unnamed wound that occurred in childhood. The devoted wife who loses herself completely in service to others because she has never learned that she has a right to exist as an individual. These are not conscious choices. These are unconscious compulsions, psychological complexes that operate beneath the threshold of awareness and determine the shape of entire lives. And when you develop the capacity to see these patterns clearly, when you can look at a person and understand not just what they are doing, but why they must do it, you possess a kind of power that can be profoundly destructive if wielded carelessly. I have seen people whose marriages were destroyed by a partner who suddenly began pointing out their unconscious patterns. I have watched families shatter when one member developed psychological insight and began using it to analyze and judge everyone around them. I have observed friendships end when someone's spiritual awakening transformed them into a kind of unconscious prosecutor, constantly revealing the hidden motivations behind others' behavior. This is not awakening. This is spiritual inflation masquerading as consciousness. It is the shadow of enlightenment, the darkness that can emerge when insight becomes contaminated with the ego's need to be special, superior, or in control. The wise person learns to see these patterns without feeling compelled to expose them. They understand that most people's unconscious scripts serve important psychological functions, that the roles people play often protect them from deeper wounds they are not yet strong enough to face. They recognize that premature exposure of unconscious material can be as harmful as a surgeon operating without anesthesia. And perhaps most importantly, they learn to examine their own motivations for wanting to share what they see. They ask themselves, am I offering this insight because it will genuinely serve this person's development? Or am I offering it because I need to demonstrate my own understanding, to prove my own awakened state, to maintain some subtle sense of superiority over those who have not seen what I have seen? This kind of ruthless self-examination is essential for anyone who has developed psychological insight, because consciousness, like any other form of power, can corrupt when it is not held with proper humility and restraint. The person who has awakened to deeper truths about human nature must also awaken to deeper truths about their own capacity for unconscious harm. There is a story from the ancient traditions that illustrates this point beautifully. A student approaches his teacher and says, "Master, I have achieved great insight into the nature of reality. I can see through all illusions, perceive the truth behind every appearance. What shall I do with this knowledge?" The teacher responds, "First, you must learn to see through the greatest illusion of all, the illusion that you are the one who has achieved this insight." This is the paradox that faces every genuinely awakened person. The recognition that consciousness does not belong to them personally, that awareness is not their individual achievement, that whatever insights they possess are gifts that have been given rather than accomplishments they have earned. When you truly understand this, when you recognize that consciousness flows through you rather than originating from you, everything changes. You no longer feel the need to prove your awakened state to others. You no longer use your insights as weapons or wear them as badges of spiritual achievement. You become, instead, a humble servant of awareness itself, someone who allows consciousness to work through them without claiming ownership of its effects. This is why the truly awakened often appear quite ordinary. They do not announce their insights or display their spiritual achievements. They do not feel compelled to enlighten others or to point out the unconscious patterns they observe. Instead, they live their lives with such authenticity, such genuine presence, such quiet wisdom, that others are naturally drawn to them without understanding exactly why. They become what I call transparent vessels for consciousness. The light shines through them, but they do not claim to be the source of that light. They offer their presence as a gift, but they do not insist that others receive it. They remain available for those who are genuinely seeking, but they do not chase after those who are not yet ready to question their own unconsciousness. This is perhaps the most profound secret that the awakened must learn to keep, not any particular insight or understanding, but the recognition that true awakening makes you smaller, not larger, more humble, not more important, more aware of what you do not know, not more certain of what you do know. The person who has genuinely encountered the depths of consciousness understands that they have barely begun to explore the infinite mystery of existence. They know that every answer leads to deeper questions, that every insight reveals greater territories of the unknown. They become comfortable with uncertainty, at peace with paradox, willing to live in the space between knowing and not knowing. And from this place of genuine humility, they can offer something far more valuable than psychological insights or spiritual teachings. They can offer their transformed presence, their authentic being, their willingness to remain conscious without needing others to validate or understand their consciousness. This is the ultimate teaching that consciousness offers to those who serve it faithfully. That the greatest gift you can give to the world is not what you know, but who you have become through your encounter with the mystery of your own existence. Not your insights, but your integration. Not your understanding, but your embodiment of what it means to be fully, consciously, courageously human. So you see, my friend, we have walked together through territories that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. We have looked into the mirror of consciousness and seen not the comfortable image we expected, but something far more complex, far more mysterious, far more demanding of our reverence and restraint. These 5 revelations I have shared with you, these dangerous truths that awaken with consciousness, they are not burdens to be carried with resentment or weapons to be wielded against others. They are sacred responsibilities, tests of your spiritual maturity, invitations to a deeper kind of service than most people ever imagine possible. The person who truly understands what I have been saying will not rush out to enlighten their family members or analyze their friends or expose the unconscious patterns they observe in their community. Instead, they will turn inward first, examining their own motivations, questioning their own need to share what they have seen, recognizing that the urge to awaken others often springs from the very unconsciousness they believe they have transcended. You must understand that consciousness is not a possession but a participation. It is not something you achieve but something that moves through you. And those who serve it most faithfully are often those who speak of it least, who carry its insights most quietly, who allow its wisdom to transform their presence rather than their pronouncements. I have spent my life exploring the depths of the human soul, and I can tell you this with absolute certainty. The greatest service you can offer to consciousness, to your fellow human beings, to the mystery of existence itself, is not to force your understanding upon others, but to become so authentic, so genuinely awake, so fully integrated in your own being, that you serve as a living invitation to the possibilities that exist within every human heart. The awakened person discovers, in the end, that their role is not to be a teacher, but to be a presence, not to provide answers, but to embody the questions that matter most, not to illuminate others, but to burn so steadily with their own inner flame that others may find the courage to kindle their own fire when they are ready. This is why we keep these dangerous truths in sacred silence, not from selfishness but from love, not from secrecy but from wisdom, not because we do not care, but because we care too deeply to interfere with the mysterious process by which each soul finds its own way home to itself. Remember this, and you will have learned something more valuable than all the psychological insights in the world. You will have learned what it means to serve consciousness rather than to possess it. And in that service, you will discover the deepest secret of all, that the awakened life is not about what you know, but about who you become through your willingness to remain forever a student of the infinite mystery of being human.